The shuttle doors opened, and Kira Vasquez took her first breath of alien air. She was 17 years old, and she was terrified, but she did not let it show on her face. The Celestin Academy stretched before her like a dream made of crystal and light and impossible architecture that seemed to float against the purple sky of this ancient world. For 6,000 years, this place had trained the children of empires, and now for the first time in all those centuries, a human was walking through. Its gates. Kira carried a single bag over her shoulder, and she walked with her back straight and her eyes forward, even though she could feel every stare burning into her skin. The other students were everywhere, and none of them looked anything like her. To her left walked a group of Velkari, and they towered above her with their insectoid bodies, covered in gleaming black armor that was part of their actual flesh, and their compound eyes tracked her movement with cold curiosity. Andrade Noble passed close enough that she could see every iridescent scale on his reptilian face, and he looked down at her the way someone might look at an insect that had wandered into a palace. Floating spheres of pure light drifted overhead, and Kira knew these were the illuminated, who were beings of energy that had existed since before her species had learned to use fire. Humanity had joined the Galactic Concordat only 40 years ago, and most of the elder species still thought of humans as primitives who had somehow stumbled into space travel by accident. Kira knew what they called her kind behind closed doors. Mayflies, because human lives were so short. Dirt walkers, because Earth was considered an unremarkable world. Soft bodies, because humans had no natural armor or weapons or any of the biological advantages that other species took for granted. But Kira was here because she had fought harder than anyone else on Earth to earn this spot, as she was not going to let their contempt break her before she even reached her assigned quarters. The Academy's central spire rose before her, and she entered through doors that were 3 times her height and clearly designed for species much larger than humans. Inside, the air was cool, and it smelled like nothing she could identify, and the walls seemed to shift with colors that her eyes could barely process. A holographic figure appeared before her, and it spoke in perfect English, which surprised her. "Welcome, student. Kira Vasquez, you have been assigned to Cohort 17. Please follow the illuminated path to your quarters. Your orientation begins in 6 standard hours." The figure vanished, and a line of soft blue light appeared on the floor, leading deeper into the building. Kira followed it through corridors filled with students who stopped talking whenever she passed and started again as soon as she was gone, and she did not need to understand their languages to know they were talking about her. Quarters were at the very end of a long hallway, and when the door opened, she understood immediately that this was an insult. The room was barely large enough for a bed, and a small desk, and a storage unit that looked like it had been old before humanity existed. Other students had suites with multiple rooms and windows that looked out on the crystal gardens, but Kira had been given what was essentially a closet. She set her bag down, and she sat on the thin bed, and she allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to feel the weight of what she had taken on. Then she stood up, and she began to unpack because feeling sorry for herself was not going to change anything. Her equipment was laid out on the desk, and she could see immediately that it was outdated compared to what she had glimpsed other students carrying. The tablet she had been issued was a model that the Academy had probably stopped using decades ago, and her training uniform was slightly too large, as if no one had bothered to get her actual measurements. But it would work, and Kira had learned a long time ago that perfect tools were less important than the will to use whatever tools you had. She changed into her uniform, and she looked at herself in the small mirror on the wall, and she practiced her expression until it showed nothing but calm confidence. Then she went to find the dining hall because she needed to eat, and she needed to be seen, and she needed to start learning everything about this place and the people in it. The dining hall was enormous, and it was filled with hundreds of students from dozens of species, and the noise was overwhelming at first. Kira got her food from a dispenser that thankfully had options labeled for human biology. And she looked for a place to sit. Every table she approached suddenly became full, or the students. They made it clear through their body language that she was not welcome. Finally, she found an empty table in the corner, and she sat down alone, and she began to eat. The food was bland, but it was nutritious, and she focused on that rather than on the laughter she could hear from nearby tables. A shadow fell over her, and she looked up to see Adradi standing there with two others behind him. And his scales caught the light in a way that told her he came from wealth and power. His name was Talos, and she would learn later that his family had controlled entire star systems for longer than human civilization had existed. "You are that human," he said, and his voice was smooth and cold and amused. "I am Kira Vasquez," she replied, and she did not stand up, because she would not give him the satisfaction of looking up at him from an even lower position. Talos smiled, and it was not a friendly expression on his reptilian face. "The Academy has lowered its standards," he said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "but I suppose even animals can be trained to perform simple tricks." His companions laughed, and several other students at nearby tables joined in. Kira took another bite of her food, and she chewed slowly, and she swallowed before she spoke. "I look forward to showing you exactly what this animal can do." The laughter stopped for just a moment, and something flickered in Thalas's eyes that might have been surprise or might have been anger. Then he turned and walked away, and the noise of the dining hall resumed, and Kira finished her meal in silence. That night she lay in her tiny bed and she stared at the ceiling. And she made a promise to herself. They could mock her, and they could underestimate her, and they could put every obstacle in her path, but she was human, and humans had spent their entire existence facing things bigger and stronger and more dangerous than themselves, and humans were still here. She closed her eyes, and she slept deeply, because tomorrow her real work would begin, and she intended to be ready for whatever this ancient place could throw at. The Academy had seen thousands of species rise and fall over its long history, but it had never seen anything quite like humanity, and it had certainly never seen anything quite like Kira Vasquez. 6 weeks had passed since Kira arrived at the Celestin Academy, and every single day had been a battle. The courses were designed for species with abilities that humans simply did not possess, and no one seemed interested in making any adjustments for her limitations. In advanced mathematics, the illuminated students could perform calculations across 11 dimensions simultaneously, while Kira struggled to keep up with her 3-dimensional human brain and physical combat training. She faced opponents with 4 arms or armored skin, or the ability to move faster than her eyes could track in tactical history. She was expected to memorize battle records from wars that had been fought before her species had invented writing. But Kira did not complain, and she did not ask for help, and she did not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her fail. She woke up 2 hours before everyone else, and she studied until her eyes burned, and she trained until her muscles screamed, and then she did it all again the next day. The other students in cohort 17 had stopped openly laughing at her, but the contempt was still there in every interaction. They spoke over her in discussions, and they accidentally bumped into her in hallways. And they made sure she knew that no matter how hard she worked, she would never truly belong here. Thalos was the worst of them, and he seemed to take personal pleasure in finding new ways to remind her of her place. Today was tactical theory, and the class was taught by Master Vershan, who was a Valkyrie strategist so old that he had commanded fleets in wars that were ancient history to everyone else in the room. His compound eyes saw everything, and his forearms moved constantly as he manipulated the holographic displays that filled the lecture hall. "Today, we will examine a scenario," he announced, and his voice clicked and buzzed in ways that the translator in Kira's ear converted to flat, monotone speech. A fleet of 100 vessels faces an enemy force of 300, and the enemy holds the high ground above a planet's gravity well, and your supply lines are extended beyond safe limits. The display showed the tactical situation in perfect detail, and Kira studied it carefully while the other students began to discuss among themselves. A Valkyrie student raised one of his arms and spoke about the importance of formation discipline and how a properly coordinated fleet could overcome numerical disadvantage. Through superior positioning, Master Vershan clicked his mandibles in what might have been approval. An illuminated student offered a complex mathematical solution involving precise energy calculations that would allow the smaller fleet to maximize damage output while minimizing exposure. Another click of approval from the ancient instructor. Thalos spoke next, and his answer was elegant and drew from draughty military traditions that had won them countless victories over thousands of years. The display shifted to show his proposed solution, and it was impressive, and Kira could see why the draughty had conquered so much of the galaxy. Then Kira raised her hand. The room went quiet, and Master Vershan's compound eyes focused on her with an expression she could not read. "The human wishes to contribute," he said, and there was something in his tone that made several students snicker. Kira stood because she wanted everyone to hear her clearly. The other solutions focus on the battle itself, she said, that they ignore the enemy commander, and every commander has weaknesses and fears and blind spots. She walked toward the display and she pointed at the enemy fleet formation. This formation is aggressive and it assumes superiority. And that tells me the enemy commander is confident, probably overconfident. She moved her finger to trace a different approach. I would not attack the fleet directly, and instead, I would send a small force to threaten something the commander values personally, and maybe a colony where their family lives or a supply depot that their career depends on. The students were staring at her now, and not with amusement. The commander would have to respond, she continued, and they would either split their forces or abandon the engagement entirely. And either way, the numerical advantage disappears. She turned to face Master Vershan directly. Wars are not won by ships alone, and they are won by breaking the will of the enemy to fight, and humans learned that lesson a very long time ago. The silence stretched for several seconds. Then Master Vershan made a sound that the translator rendered as dismissive. Crudy pronounced, and the word echoed through the lecture hall, and several students laughed. That is the answer of a species that wins through stubbornness and trickery, rather than true military brilliance. And it is the approach of scavengers, not warriors. Thalos was smiling broadly, and he leaned over to whisper something to the student next to him, and they both laughed. Kira sat down, and her face was burning, but she kept her expression neutral. The lecture continued, and Master Vershan moved on to other scenarios, and Kira participated no further. But that night, when everyone else was sleeping, she went to the Academy archives and she began to search. The scenario Master Vershan had presented was too specific to be hypothetical, and she had a feeling she knew why. It took her 3 hours, but she found it: the Battle of Kethver. And it had happened over 4,000 years ago, and it was one of the worst defeats in Valkyrie military history. The enemy had been a species called the Thanaki, and they had been smaller and weaker, and technologically inferior to the Valkyrie in every way, but they had won, and they had won using almost exactly the strategy Kira had described. They had threatened the Valkyrie commander's homeworld and forced him to split his forces, and then they had destroyed both halves separately. 70,000 Valkyrie warriors had died that day because their commander had been too arrogant to imagine that an inferior species could outthink him. Kira saved the file, and she smiled to herself. In the darkness of the archive room, Master Vershan had called her answer crude, and he had called it the approach of scavengers, and he had dismissed her in front of the entire class. But his own ancestors had lost everything to exactly that approach. She did not confront him with this information, because that would gain her nothing but an enemy. Instead, she filed it away in her memory alongside everything else. She was learning about this place, and these people, they thought humans were primitive, and they thought humans were weak, and they thought humans had nothing to teach species that had ruled the stars for millennia. They were wrong, and sooner or later Kira was going to prove it. The Crucible trial was coming, and everyone at the academy knew what that meant. Once each year, the students faced a test that combined combat and survival and strategy into a single brutal examination, and the Crucible had killed students from every species that had ever attended the academy. It was not designed to be safe, and it was not designed to be fair, and the instructors made no apologies for the blood that had been spilled in its long history. The weak were expected to withdraw before the trial began, and no one considered this shameful because surviving the Crucible required abilities that not everyone possessed. Kira had been hearing whispers for days, and she knew exactly what those whispers were about. The other members of Cohort 17 wanted her gone, and they were going to find a way to make that happen before she could embarrass them in the trial. She was in the training room alone when they came for her. Thalos entered first, and his scales gleamed under the harsh lights, and behind him came 3 others from the cohort. There was Vexari, who was a Velkari, female with mandibles that could cut through steel, and there was Luminex, who was an illuminated, whose energy form burned bright blue, and there was Korath, who was a massive gray-skinned species, whose people were known for strength that could crush starship hulls. The door sealed behind them, and Kira understood immediately that this had been planned. She set down the training weapon she had been practicing with, and she turned to face them with her hands at her sides. Thalos stopped a few meters away, and his smile was cold and satisfied human. He said, and the word was an insult in his mouth, "We need to discuss your future at this academy." Kira said nothing, and she waited because she wanted to understand exactly what they intended. "The Crucible is approaching," Thalos continued, "and our cohort has a reputation to maintain, and we cannot afford to be dragged down by someone who does not belong here." Still, Kira remained silent, and she watched their positions, and she noted the tension in their bodies, and she calculated distances and angles without even thinking about it. "You have 2 options," Thalos said, and he held up one clawed finger. "First, you can withdraw from the academy voluntarily, and you can go back to your primitive world, and you can tell your people that you tried, but the stars were simply too much for humanity." He raised a second finger, "Or we invoke the right of demonstration, and you face one of us in formal combat, and when you lose, you will be required to withdraw under academy law." Kira had read about the right of demonstration in the academy archives, and it was an old tradition that allowed students to challenge each other when there were questions of worthiness. If she refused the challenge, she would be marked as a coward, and her time at the academy would become even more difficult than it already was. If she accepted and lost, she would have to leave. The 4 of them stood there waiting for her answer, and she could see the confidence in their eyes, because they knew there was no way a human could defeat any one of them in single combat. Kira took a slow breath, and she let it out, and then she smiled. "I accept the right of demonstration," she said, and her voice was calm and clear. Thalos nodded, and his satisfaction was obvious. "Then choose your opponent, human, and choose carefully, because this will be the last decision you make at this academy." He gestured to himself and to the 3 behind him, and each of them was larger and stronger and faster than her, and each of them came from a species with thousands of years of martial tradition. Kira looked at each of them in turn, and she took her time because she wanted them to wonder what she was thinking. Thalos with his scales that could turn away blades and his claws that could tear through armor. Vexari with her 4 arms and her compound eyes that could track movement in every direction. Luminex, whose energy form could burn hot enough to melt metal and who could move at the speed of light. Korath, whose fists could punch through walls and whose hide was thick enough to stop projectiles. Anyone of them could kill her without much effort if they truly wanted to. Kira finished her assessment, and she looked directly at Thalos, and her smile grew wider. "I choose all 4 of you," she said. Simultaneously, the silence that followed was absolute. Thalos stared at her, and for the first time since she had arrived at the academy, she saw something other than contempt in his eyes. She saw confusion. "That is not how the rite works," he said slowly. Kira shrugged, and she kept her voice casual even, though her heart was pounding. "The rite says I can choose my opponent, and it does not say I can only choose one, and I am choosing to face all four of you at the same time." Vexari made a clicking sound that might have been laughter or might have been alarm. Luminex pulsed brighter for a moment, and Korath shifted his massive weight from one foot to the other. They had expected her to pick the weakest among them and try to survive long enough to claim a technical victory. They had not expected this. The psychology of the situation had shifted, and Kira could see them processing what this meant. If four elite students from elder species defeated one small human girl, there would be no glory in it, and no one would be impressed. But if she survived for even a few minutes against all of them, then the embarrassment would be theirs forever. Thalos recovered his composure, but it took him longer than it should have agreed. He said, and his voice was harder now, and she had gotten under his scales. "Tomorrow in the main arena and full combat parameters and no restrictions." He stepped closer, and he loomed over her, and his eyes were cold with anger. "You will regret this, human, and I'm going to enjoy teaching you exactly how insignificant your species truly is." Kira looked up at him without flinching. "I guess we will find out." They left, and the door unsealed behind them, and Kira was alone again in the training room. She stood there for a long moment, and then she walked to the center of the room, and she began to stretch. She had 20 hours to prepare for the most important fight of her life, and she was going to use every single minute. Tomorrow, the Academy would see what a human could do. Tomorrow, they would learn why her species had survived everything the universe had thrown at them. Tomorrow, everything would change. The arena was full, and Kira had never seen so many beings gathered in one place. Word had spread through the academy like fire, and everyone wanted to see what would happen when the human girl faced four of the finest warriors from the elder species. Students filled every seat, and they stood in the aisles, and they crowded against the railings of the upper galleries, and the noise of their conversations was like thunder. Instructors had come as well, and Kira spotted Master Version in a position of honor near the front, and his compound eyes were fixed on the empty arena floor. Even some of the academy administrators had appeared, and they were ancient beings whose names Kira did not know, but whose presence meant that this event had become something more than a simple student dispute. The arena itself was a perfect circle of white stone, and it was surrounded by energy barriers that would contain the combat but would not interfere with it. Kira stood in the preparation area, and she checked her equipment one final time. She wore standard academy training gear, and she carried no weapons, because she had requested hand-to-hand combat only. When Thalos had agreed to this, he had smiled because he thought she was making it easier for them to defeat her. He did not understand that weapons would have given them the advantage, and that her only chance was to get close where her size could become a benefit rather than a liability. The signal came, and Kira walked out onto the arena floor, and the noise of the crowd grew even louder from the opposite side. Her four opponents emerged, and they were magnificent and terrifying. Thalos wore ceremonial armor that had been in his family for 3,000 years, and his scales gleamed like jewels, and his claws were polished to razor sharpness. Vexari had 4 fighting blades mounted on her forearms, and her compound eyes reflected the light in 1,000 directions. Luminex blazed with energy that made the air shimmer, and heat radiated from their form in visible waves. Karth wore no armor because his hide was armor enough, and his fists were the size of Kira's head. They spread out as they approached, and they began to circle her, and the crowd fell silent in anticipation. Kira stood in the center of the arena, and she breathed slowly as she watched them with eyes that had evolved to track predators across the grasslands of ancient Earth. The signal to begin sounded, and Thalos charged. He was fast, and his claws led the way, and he expected to end this in the first second. But Kira was not where he expected her to be. She had moved before he did, because she had read the tension in his muscles and the shift of his weight and the direction of his gaze, and she knew where he was going to attack before he knew it himself. This was what humans did, and this was how they had survived. They could not outrun the predators, and they could not outfight them, and so they learned to predict them and to be somewhere else when death arrived. Thalos swept through empty air, and his momentum carried him past her, and Kira struck the back of his knee, where his scales were thinnest, and he stumbled. The crowd gasped. Vexari came next with all four blades spinning, and she was faster than Thalos, and her attacks came from multiple angles simultaneously. Kira did not try to block, because blocking would shatter her bones. Instead, she flowed between the attacks, and each blade missed her by centimeters. And she shrugged nerve clusters that she had studied in the Academy Medical Archives. Vexari's lower left arm went limp, and she hissed in shock. Luminex launched a bolt of pure energy, and Kira dove to the side and rolled and came up running, because standing still against an illuminated was death. But she had watched Luminex in training, and she knew that after each major attack, there was a half-second delay while they recharged. She counted that half-second, and then she changed direction and sprinted directly at the blazing form. Luminex tried to fire again, but Kira was already inside their range, and she struck the core of their energy matrix with a precise blow that disrupted their coherence. The illuminated flickered and dimmed and staggered backward. Korath roared and charged, and the ground shook with each of his steps, and his fist came down like a meteor. Kira was too slow to dodge completely, and the edge of his blow caught her shoulder and sent her spinning across the arena floor. Pain exploded through her body, and she tasted blood, but she turned the spin into a roll and came up on her feet, because stopping meant dying. The crowd was making sounds she could not identify, and she did not have time to wonder what they meant. All four opponents were recovering, and they were angry now, and they had stopped underestimating her. Deleuze spoke to the others in a language she did not understand, and they shifted into a formation, and they began to coordinate their attacks. This was what she had feared, because alone they were dangerous, but together they were nearly unstoppable. But Kira had prepared for this too. She had spent the night studying their species and their fighting styles and their psychology. And she knew that the elder races fought with discipline and tradition and predictable patterns, so she gave them chaos. She screamed, and it was a human war cry that her ancestors had used to frighten predators on the African plains, and it was loud and wild and utterly alien to everything these species knew. Then she attacked Korath, not because she could hurt him, but because he was the slowest, and because attacking him meant the others had to adjust their formation. She ducked under his arm, and she climbed his body like a tree, and she wrapped herself around his head, and she covered his eyes with her hands. He bellowed and swung wildly, and Thalos had to dodge to avoid being hit, and Vexari pulled back and the formation shattered. Kira let go and dropped and rolled between Korath's legs, and she kept moving, and she never stopped moving, because stillness was death. The fight became a blur of motion and pain and desperate survival. She took hits that would have killed her if they had landed fully, but she twisted at the last moment and turned killing blows into glancing ones. She bled from a dozen wounds, and her left arm was not working properly, and every breath hurt. But she did not fall. She targeted joints and pressure points and nerve clusters, and she exploited every weakness she had identified, and she fought with everything humanity had learned in 10,000 years of being prey. Minutes passed, and they felt like hours, and still Kira stood. Thalos was limping, and Vexari had lost the use of two arms, and Luminex was barely glowing, and Korath was breathing hard and bleeding from cuts around his eyes. The crowd had stopped making noise, and the arena was silent, except for the sounds of combat. Finally, the signal sounded, and the fight was over. Kira stood in the center of the arena, and she was swaying, and her vision was blurring, and she was fairly certain that several of her ribs were broken. But she was standing. Her 4 opponents were on the ground around her, and they were conscious, but they were not getting up. The silence stretched and stretched. Then a sound began from somewhere in the crowd, and it was clicking, and Kira recognized it as Valkyrie applause. She looked up and saw Master Version on his feet, and his mandibles were clicking together, and his compound eyes were fixed on her. Others joined, and the sound grew, and soon the entire arena was filled with the noise of 1,000 species expressing approval in 1,000 different ways. Kira looked at Talos, who was staring at her from the ground, and his expression was something she had never seen on his face before. It was respect. She wanted to say something profound, but her legs gave out, and the world went dark, and the last thing she heard was the roar of the crowd calling her name. Kira woke in the medical bay, and the ceiling above her was white and unfamiliar. She tried to move, and pain reminded her of everything that had happened, and she groaned and settled back onto the bed. A medical drone floated over and scanned her, and its mechanical voice informed her that she had 3 broken ribs and a fractured collarbone and severe bruising across 60% of her body and a concussion that was being treated with neural regeneration. She had been unconscious for 2 days. The drone also informed her that she had visitors waiting, and that they had been waiting since she was brought in. Kira asked who they were, and the drone listed names that made her eyes widen. The door opened before she could respond, and Master Version entered, and behind him came 3 other instructors, whose names she recognized from the Academy's history. They were legends, and they had trained warriors who had conquered star systems, and now they were standing in her medical room looking at her like she was something they had never seen before. Master Version approached her bed, and his compound eyes studied her for a long moment. "We have been investigating you," he said, and his voice was quieter than she had ever heard. Kira was not sure what to say, so she said nothing. "After your demonstration, we reviewed every moment of your time at this academy, and we analyzed your combat footage from every angle, and we studied your species in ways we have never studied any species." Before he paused, and his mandibles clicked slowly, "We were wrong about humanity." The words hung in the air, and Kira felt something shift inside her chest that had nothing to do with her. Broken ribs. One of the other instructors stepped forward, and she was an illuminated who burned with ancient golden light. "Your species does not specialize," she said, and her voice was like music translated through machinery. "Every other species in the Concordat evolved to fill a specific role, and we became the best at one thing, and we built our civilizations around that strength. But humans adapt, and you change, and you refuse to accept limitations." The third instructor was a massive creature whose species Kira did not recognize, and he spoke in a voice like grinding stones. "We reviewed your planet's history, and we saw what you have survived, and ice ages, and predators, and plagues, and wars against yourselves, and extinction events that should have ended you." He shook his enormous head, and something like wonder crossed his alien face. "You should not exist, and yet here you are." Master Version moved closer, and he looked down at her with those ancient compound eyes. "I told you that your tactical answer was crude, and I told you it was the approach of scavengers, and I dismissed you in front of your peers." He was silent for a moment. "The scenario I presented was real, and it was the Battle of Kethver, and my ancestors lost 70,000 warriors that day to a species that used exactly the approach you described." Kira met his gaze, and she did not look away. "I know," she said quietly. "I found the records that night." Mershin made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Of course you did." He straightened, and his forearms folded behind his back. "I was wrong to dismiss your answer, and I was wrong to underestimate your species, and I will not make that mistake again." The instructors left, and Kira lay there processing what had just happened. Over the following days, more visitors came. Students she had never spoken to stopped by to pay their respects, and some of them apologized for how they had treated her, and others simply wanted to talk. Cohort members who had ignored her for months now asked her questions about human history and human warfare and human psychology. On the third day, Thalos came. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, and his scales had lost some of their arrogant gleam, and he looked uncertain in a way she had never seen. Then he walked to her bedside, and he stood there, and he did not speak. Kira waited. I have fought many opponents, Thalos finally said, and I have defeated warriors from a dozen species, and I have never faced anyone like you. He paused, and his claws flexed at his sides. You should not have won, and by every measure, we should have destroyed you in seconds, and yet you stood, and you kept standing, and I do not understand how. Kira considered her answer carefully. On my world, she said, there is a saying that it is not the size of the dog in the fight, but the size of the fight in the dog. Talos tilted his head, and confusion crossed his features. I do not know what a dog is. It does not matter, Kira said, and for the first time she smiled at him. The point is that humans have spent our entire existence fighting things bigger and stronger and more dangerous than ourselves, and we are still here because we refuse to accept that we are supposed to lose. Thalos was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded once, and it was a gesture of acknowledgement between equals. I will see you when you recover, he said, and then he left. On the fifth day, Kira was released from the medical bay, and she returned to her quarters to find that they had been changed. Tiny closet room had been replaced with a proper suite, and her outdated equipment had been replaced with the best the Academy could provide. There was a message waiting for her from the Academy administration. It informed her that her classification had been updated in all official records. Previous classification for human students had been primitive and minimal threat and low. Potential new classification was apex adaptive species and high strategic value and priority observation. At the bottom of the message was a note that made her heart swell with pride. It said that the Galactic Concordat had requested information about human recruitment and that several species were interested in forming military alliances with Earth One. Human Girl had walked into the Academy, and the entire galaxy was beginning to reconsider what humanity might become. That night, Kira opened a communication channel to Earth, and she saw the faces of the selection committee who had chosen her, and behind them she saw thousands of young humans watching the broadcast. They were waiting for her to speak, and she could see the hope in their eyes. She thought about everything she had endured and everything she had learned and everything that was still to come. She had 3 more years at the Academy, and she intended to use every moment of them. This is just the beginning, she told them, and her voice was steady and strong. I opened the door, but you are going to walk through it, and someday there will be humans at every academy and on every council and in every fleet. She smiled, and she felt the weight of her species' future on her shoulders, and she did not find it heavy. They thought we were primitives, she said, and they thought we were weak, and they thought we had nothing to offer the galaxy. She leaned forward, and her eyes blazed with certainty. They were wrong. The transmission ended, and Kira stood at her window, and she looked out at the crystal spires of the Academy and the alien stars beyond. Somewhere out there was Earth, and somewhere out there were billions of humans who were just beginning to understand what they could become. The Academy had existed for 6,000 years, and it had seen species rise and fall, and it had trained the rulers of empires, but it had never seen anything like humanity. And now, thanks to one girl who refused to stay down, the entire galaxy knew it. Kira smiled, and she turned away from the window, and she picked up her studies. Because tomorrow there would be new challenges and new obstacles and new battles to fight, and she intended to win every single one of them. This was only the beginning.